Imagine being strapped to a wooden table while a medieval torturer carefully explains that you're about to experience something far more horrific than any quick execution could ever be. He shows you an innocuous-looking contraption that resembles a simple wooden frame with metal fittings and tells you that this device won't kill you. In fact, it's specifically designed to keep you alive for as long as possible while systematically destroying every aspect of what makes you human. Over the next several hours, days, or even weeks, this machine will methodically stretch your body until your joints separate, your bones crack, and your muscles tear. But it will do so with such precise control that you'll remain conscious and aware throughout every moment of your gradual dismantlement. This was the rack, and what made it truly diabolical wasn't just the physical agony it inflicted, but the psychological torture of knowing that your suffering had been carefully calculated to last as long as possible while leaving you alive to experience every second of your own destruction. What made the rack infinitely worse than a quick death was that it was designed by people who had studied human anatomy specifically to understand how much damage a body could sustain while keeping the victim conscious and responsive. Medieval torturers weren't sadistic amateurs. They were skilled technicians who had learned through experimentation exactly how far they could stretch human joints before permanent damage occurred, how to apply pressure gradually to maximize pain while avoiding fatal injuries, and how to manipulate the psychological aspects of the torture to break their victims' minds as thoroughly as their bodies. The rack represented the pinnacle of their perverted expertise, a machine that could reduce a healthy human being to a writhing, elongated wreck while ensuring they remained alive to confess, provide information, or simply serve as an example to others who might consider crossing those in power. The origins of the rack can be traced back to the early 15th century, when the Duke of Exeter introduced the device to England as part of his campaign to extract confessions from political prisoners and religious dissidents. But this wasn't some crude medieval contraption thrown together by ignorant torturers. It was a precisely engineered machine that represented cutting-edge technology for its time. The frame was constructed from specially selected hardwoods that could withstand enormous tension without breaking, while the ropes and pulleys were designed with mechanical advantage systems that allowed operators to apply gradual, controlled pressure that could be increased by tiny increments over extended periods. The most sophisticated versions included calibrated mechanisms that could measure exactly how much the victim's body had been stretched, allowing torturers to operate right at the edge of what the human frame could endure without crossing into immediate death. The psychological horror of the rack began long before the physical torture started. Victims were typically brought to the torture chamber days or even weeks before their interrogation, forced to observe the device and listen to detailed explanations of what would happen to their bodies. Master torturers would describe with clinical precision how the stretching would begin gently, feeling almost like a therapeutic massage, before gradually increasing to the point where joints would separate and bones would crack like dry branches. They would explain how the victim's spine would elongate until their ribs separated, how their arms and legs would be pulled from their sockets, and how their internal organs would shift and compress as their torso was stretched beyond its natural limits. This psychological preparation was designed to break the victim's will before the physical torture even began, with many prisoners confessing to crimes they hadn't committed simply to avoid experiencing what they had been told awaited them. The actual process of being racked was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty that could last anywhere from hours to weeks, depending on the information being sought and the victim's resistance to pain. The procedure always began the same way. The victim was stripped naked and secured to the device with specially designed restraints that distributed pressure evenly to prevent any merciful loss of consciousness. The initial stretching was indeed gentle, creating a false sense of relief that made the gradual escalation even more psychologically devastating. Master operators knew exactly how to manipulate the mechanism to create waves of increasing pain, allowing victims brief respites that gave them hope before applying more pressure than before. This pattern of relief and intensification was designed to break down psychological defenses while preventing the victim from adapting to a consistent level of pain. What made the rack particularly diabolical was how it turned the victim's own body into an instrument of self-torture. As the stretching continued, the weight of the victim's internal organs would begin pulling downward while their skeleton was pulled in the opposite direction, creating internal pressure that felt like being torn apart from the inside. Victims described feeling their ribs separating one by one, their spine elongating until they could feel gaps between their vertebrae, and their muscles tearing with audible snapping sounds that echoed through the torture chamber. But perhaps most horrifying of all was the gradual dislocation of joints, which created a sensation of the victim's limbs being slowly removed from their body while remaining attached by increasingly stretched tendons and ligaments. The medical knowledge that went into perfecting the rack was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. Torturers had learned through extensive experimentation that the human spine could be stretched by as much as 6 inches before permanent paralysis occurred, that shoulder joints could be dislocated in ways that caused maximum pain while allowing them to be reset if the victim survived, and that the ribs could be separated without puncturing vital organs if the pressure was applied correctly. They had also discovered that certain stretching patterns could affect the victim's ability to speak clearly, allowing them to control when and how confessions could be extracted. The most skilled operators could manipulate the device to cause specific types of pain in targeted areas of the body, essentially torturing individual body parts in sequence to break down resistance systematically. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the rack was how it was used not just for extracting confessions, but for entertainment and political theater. Public racking sessions were often attended by nobility and church officials who viewed the proceedings as a form of sophisticated entertainment that demonstrated the power of legitimate authority over rebellious subjects. These sessions could last for days, with the victim's agony being prolonged deliberately to provide maximum spectacle for the assembled audience. Detailed records from the Tower of London describe racking sessions that continued for over a week, with the victim being removed from the device each night to prevent death from exposure or exhaustion, only to be returned the following morning for additional stretching. The psychological impact on witnesses was as important as the physical impact on victims, creating a climate of terror that discouraged any form of dissent or resistance to authority. The economic aspect of rack torture reveals just how institutionalized this form of cruelty had become in medieval society. The construction and maintenance of rack devices required significant investment, with the most sophisticated versions costing the equivalent of a nobleman's annual income. Specialized craftsmen were employed to build and calibrate the machines, while master torturers commanded high salaries for their expertise in operating them effectively. The Tower of London employed a full-time staff of rack operators, each trained in different aspects of the torture process and capable of working in teams to provide round-the-clock interrogation sessions. Account books from various medieval courts show regular expenditures for rope replacement, mechanical repairs, and facility upgrades designed to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of rack torture operations. The religious justification for rack torture was perhaps even more disturbing than its political applications. Church authorities developed elaborate theological arguments claiming that the physical suffering inflicted by the rack was actually beneficial to the victim's soul, purging them of sin and preparing them for salvation. The Spanish Inquisition elevated rack torture to a sacred ritual, with special prayers and ceremonies designed to sanctify the process and ensure that the victim's suffering served God's purpose. Inquisitors genuinely believed that they were performing acts of mercy by subjecting heretics to prolonged agony that would force them to confess their sins and achieve spiritual redemption. This religious framework allowed torturers to view their work as holy service rather than criminal brutality, enabling them to inflict suffering with clear consciences and even genuine compassion for their victims' eternal souls. The technological evolution of the rack throughout the 15th and 16th centuries demonstrates the systematic approach that authorities took to perfecting human suffering. Early versions were relatively crude devices that often killed victims accidentally by applying too much pressure too quickly, but successive generations of improvements created machines capable of incredible precision and control. The Spanish Inquisition developed versions with graduated scales that allowed operators to document exactly how much each victim had been stretched, creating detailed records that could be used to calibrate future sessions or compare the resistance levels of different prisoners. English models incorporated sophisticated pulley systems that could apply pressure so gradually that victims might not initially realize they were being tortured, making it easier to extract confessions through what appeared to be simple conversation. The psychological techniques employed alongside rack torture were as sophisticated as the physical mechanisms themselves. Master interrogators developed elaborate scripts designed to manipulate the victim's mental state during stretching sessions, alternating between false sympathy and threats of increased punishment. They would describe in graphic detail how much worse the torture could become, while offering immediate relief in exchange for cooperation. Some operators specialized in creating false hope, repeatedly promising that the session was almost over while continuing to increase the pressure. Others focused on psychological humiliation, forcing victims to acknowledge their helplessness and beg for mercy that would never come. These mental manipulation techniques were often more effective than the physical torture itself, breaking down resistance through despair and psychological exhaustion rather than simple pain. The medical aftermath of rack torture was deliberately designed to create living examples of what happened to those who opposed authority. Victims who survived the experience were often permanently disabled, with elongated limbs, dislocated joints, and spinal damage that served as visible reminders of their ordeal. These physical deformities weren't accidental side effects, but intended consequences, creating human billboards that advertised the consequences of resistance. Many survivors were unable to walk normally, speak clearly, or perform basic tasks, making them dependent on charity while serving as constant warnings to their communities about the price of defying legitimate authority. The psychological trauma was equally permanent, with survivors often developing what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, including nightmares, panic attacks, and complete inability to tolerate any form of physical restraint. The documentation of rack torture procedures reveals the bureaucratic mindset that treated human suffering as an administrative process, requiring careful record-keeping and quality control. Official torture manuals from the period provide step-by-step instructions for operating the device, including detailed diagrams showing proper positioning techniques and pressure application methods. These documents read like technical manuals, with clinical descriptions of how to achieve optimal results while minimizing the risk of accidental death. Some include troubleshooting guides for dealing with common problems, such as victims who lost consciousness too quickly or prisoners whose joints dislocated before confessions could be extracted. The systematic nature of these procedures demonstrates how thoroughly institutionalized torture had become in medieval society. The international spread of rack technology reveals how governments actively shared torture techniques and learned from each other's innovations in inflicting human suffering. Diplomatic correspondence from the period includes detailed discussions of rack design improvements and operational techniques, with various courts trading expertise in the same way they might share advances in military technology or agricultural methods. The French developed specialized versions designed for extracting confessions from wealthy prisoners who could afford bribes, incorporating mechanisms that could be adjusted to cause psychological pressure without permanent physical damage. German states created portable versions that could be transported to remote locations for interrogating prisoners who couldn't be brought to central facilities. Italian city-states pioneered combination devices that integrated rack torture with other forms of punishment, maximizing the efficiency of their judicial processes. The decline of rack torture didn't come about through any sudden moral awakening or humanitarian reform movement. Instead, it gradually fell out of favor as more efficient methods of extracting confessions were developed and as changing political systems reduced the need for spectacular displays of authority. The rise of professional police forces and more sophisticated investigative techniques made torture-based confessions less necessary, while the emergence of constitutional governments limited the arbitrary power that had made rack torture possible. However, the device continued to be used in some jurisdictions well into the 18th century, and various modified versions appeared during later periods of political repression and war. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the principles behind rack torture, the systematic application of gradually increasing pressure to break human resistance, have influenced interrogation and punishment techniques throughout history. Modern psychological torture methods often employ the same basic concepts of prolonged pressure, false hope, and systematic dehumanization that made the rack so effective at breaking its victims. The device itself may be obsolete, but the mentality that created it continues to influence how authorities approach the problem of extracting compliance from unwilling subjects. The legacy of the rack serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty when that cruelty is given official sanction and scientific refinement. The device wasn't the product of primitive brutality, but of sophisticated intelligence applied to the problem of causing maximum human suffering while maintaining plausible moral justification. The torturers who operated these machines weren't monsters, but ordinary people who had been trained to view extreme cruelty as necessary and even virtuous service to legitimate authority. This institutionalization of torture demonstrates how quickly civilized societies can descend into systematic barbarism when fear, authority, and ideology combine to override basic human empathy. What do you think about this absolutely horrifying demonstration of how human intelligence can be turned toward perfecting suffering rather than preventing it? Can you imagine living in a society where such systematic torture was not only legal, but considered a necessary tool of justice and governance? The fact that entire institutions were built around perfecting human agony really makes you wonder about the capacity for evil that exists within supposedly civilized societies, doesn't it? Let me know in the comments what you think about how ordinary people could participate in such systematized cruelty. I'm genuinely curious about your thoughts on what psychological and social factors could make such institutionalized torture seem acceptable to entire cultures. If you found this investigation into one of history's most systematically cruel torture devices as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about the darkest chapters of human history that reveal uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and authority. Ring that notification bell because our next deep dive will expose another historical horror that demonstrates just how far civilized societies have been willing to go in the name of justice and order. Trust me, you won't believe what passed for legitimate law enforcement in our supposedly enlightened past.